You ever hear of a tow truck driver who stole $4.1 million from the Latin Mafia and vanished without a trace? At 3:47 a.m. on November 2nd, 2021, Mike Santos finished loading the last bundles of Mafia cash into his father's dusty old Airstream trailer. He wasn't a hacker, not some ex-con, just a broke tow truck driver in Miami, quietly ripping off one of the most dangerous crime families in America. By sunrise, he was gone. No suspects, no witnesses. Just three stripped luxury cars in a city impound lot, and a Mafia with one hell of a problem. Before I tell you how Mike pulled off the boldest heist Miami's ever seen, hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment. What city are you watching from? Because trust me, this story isn't just about money. It's about revenge, survival, and a guy who was never supposed to win. It all started 9 months earlier, when Mike was towing illegally parked vehicles for a company called Cruise Recovery. A company that, as he'd soon discover, was part of a much bigger, much dirtier operation. The Latino Mafia's scheme was brilliant in its simplicity. They would pack millions of dollars in cash into specially modified vehicles and park them near designated car wash locations throughout Miami. The vehicles would sit for exactly 32 minutes while Mafia operatives conducted business inside the car washes. Then Cruise Recovery would receive anonymous tips about illegally parked vehicles and would tow the cars to the city impound lot. At the impound lot, Mafia associates would pay the fines and retrieve their vehicles, along with the millions of dollars hidden inside. The entire operation looked completely legitimate and left no paper trail that could be traced back to the crime family's drug trafficking activities. Mike Santos was nothing more than an unwitting courier in a system he didn't understand. The Latino crime family had connections to major Mexican cartels, but operated independently in South Florida territory. They had corrupted city officials, municipal workers, and even some police officers to ensure their money laundering operation could function without interference. The family was led by Eduardo Morales, a sophisticated criminal who had transformed a small Miami gang into a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise. But Mike began to notice patterns that didn't make sense. Every Tuesday, he would receive calls to tow vehicles from the same locations near car washes on Northwest 27th Avenue and Flagler Street. The cars were always expensive luxury vehicles with license plates from Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Most strange of all, the same vehicles would appear week after week in the exact same locations. Mike's curiosity was first aroused when he accidentally opened the trunk of a Cadillac Escalade while preparing to tow it. Instead of typical personal belongings, Mike found unusual insulation behind the trunk panels and sophisticated modifications that suggested the vehicle had been professionally altered. Mike didn't think much of it at the time, but he filed the observation away in his memory. 2 weeks later, while towing a different vehicle, Mike discovered a fragment of vacuum-sealed packaging with a logo from Bancomer, Mexico, a Mexican bank. Mike realized that someone was using these vehicles to transport something valuable across international borders. When Mike checked the vehicle identification numbers against the DMV database, he discovered that several of the cars had fake VIN numbers and were not legally registered in the United States. Mike's growing suspicion was confirmed when he mentioned his observations to Carlos Mendez, an old mechanic who worked at a garage near the impound lot. Carlos took Mike aside and explained the situation in blunt terms. "Those cars are packages for the Mafia," Carlos said. "You better not mess with them if you want to keep breathing." Mike realized he had stumbled onto something much bigger and more dangerous than simple car theft. Instead of backing away from the situation, Mike's curiosity drove him to investigate further. He began keeping a detailed notebook documenting the patterns he observed in the vehicle towing operations. Mike recorded license plate numbers, arrival times, locations, and any unusual features he noticed about the vehicles. Over the course of several months, Mike developed a comprehensive map of the cartel's money laundering network. Mike discovered that the vehicles arrived in Miami via the Tamiami Trail, a major highway that connected the city to the Mexican border. Each vehicle would park near a designated car wash for exactly 32 minutes before being towed to the impound lot. The timing was so precise that Mike realized the entire operation was coordinated by people who understood law enforcement procedures and city bureaucracy. Mike's breakthrough came when he decided to look inside one of the vehicles more carefully. While towing a Toyota Sequoia, Mike removed the trunk panels and discovered two packages containing $100,000 each. The packages were marked with black ink labels reading NCS 2, Norte 88, and included a note in Spanish that read, Entrega segura no abrir hasta llamada, which Mike translated as, safe delivery, do not open until call. Mike researched the abbreviation NCS and discovered references to Norte Cartel del Sur in DEA reports and news articles about drug trafficking investigations. Mike realized that he was not just moving cars, he was transporting millions of dollars in drug money for a Latino crime family that had connections to Mexican cartels. The vehicles were mobile bank vaults designed to move cash through Miami without attracting law enforcement attention. Mike's discovery put him in an impossible situation. He could report what he had learned to law enforcement, but he had no evidence and no guarantee that the police would believe his story. Mike also realized that his dispatcher, Anthony Ruiz, knew about the Mafia operation and was probably being paid to ensure that the right vehicles were towed at the right times. Mike's suspicions about Anthony were confirmed when he casually mentioned that some of the vehicles seemed unusual. Anthony smiled and told Mike that everyone sees things, but not everyone lives long enough to tell anyone about them. Mike understood that he was trapped in a criminal conspiracy and that any attempt to expose it could result in his death. But Mike also realized that his position gave him unique knowledge about the Latino Mafia's operations. He knew their schedules, their procedures, and their security measures. Mike began to consider whether he could use this information to steal from the crime family and escape Miami with enough money to start a new life somewhere far away. Mike spent months developing a plan that would allow him to steal millions of dollars from the Mafia while making it appear that the theft had been committed by someone else. But the planning process was far more complex and dangerous than Mike had initially realized. He needed to understand every detail of the operation before he could exploit its weaknesses. Mike began conducting surveillance of the car wash locations where the money-laden vehicles were parked. He would drive by during his off hours, taking photographs and making notes about security measures, timing, and personnel. Mike discovered that each car wash was staffed by armed guards who monitored the parking areas and would respond immediately to any suspicious activity. Mike also needed to test his plan for hiding the stolen money in his father's old camping trailer. The trailer was a vintage Airstream that had been sitting unused in the warehouse since his father's death from COVID complications. Mike spent weeks modifying the trailer's interior, creating hidden compartments that could hold millions of dollars without being detected during casual inspection. The modification process required Mike to remove interior panels, install false floors, and create secret storage areas that looked like normal RV equipment. Mike used his mechanical skills and knowledge of vehicle construction to build compartments that were virtually invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Mike tested the compartments repeatedly using bags of scrap metal to simulate the weight and bulk of cash bundles. Mike also needed to create false documentation that would support his cover story if he was stopped by law enforcement during his escape. Mike obtained fake identification documents through contacts in Miami's criminal underworld and established a false business identity that would explain why he was traveling with a camping trailer. Mike even opened bank accounts under his false name to create a paper trail that would support his cover story. But getting the fake documents proved far more dangerous than Mike had anticipated. His contact was a forger named Jimmy Restrepo, who operated out of a small print shop in Hialeah. Jimmy had been recommended by Carlos Mendez, but Mike didn't realize that Jimmy was already under surveillance by federal agents investigating document fraud in South Florida. When Mike arrived at Jimmy's shop for their second meeting, he noticed an unmarked van parked across the street with tinted windows. Mike's military training had taught him to recognize surveillance operations, and he immediately suspected that law enforcement was watching the location. Mike drove past the shop without stopping and called Jimmy from a payphone to warn him about the suspicious vehicle. Jimmy confirmed that he had been feeling paranoid about being watched and suggested that they meet at a different location the following week. But Mike couldn't afford to wait that long because his timeline for the theft was rapidly approaching. Mike needed his false documents within days, or his entire plan would have to be postponed indefinitely. Mike took an enormous risk by approaching another forger recommended by someone at a bar frequented by criminals and corrupt officials. The new contact was a woman named Sofia Vega, who worked out of her apartment in Little Havana. Sophia was more expensive than Jimmy, but she promised to have Mike's documents ready within 48 hours. Sophia's operation was more professional than Jimmy's, but it was also more dangerous because she had connections to the same Latino crime families that Mike was planning to rob. When Sophia asked Mike why he needed false documents, Mike gave her a story about fleeing an abusive ex-husband. Sophia seemed to believe the story, but Mike worried that she might mention their transaction to the wrong people. Mike's fears were justified when Sophia called him the day before his planned theft to warn him that someone had been asking questions about recent customers who had purchased false identification. Sophia didn't know who was asking the questions, but she advised Mike to be extremely careful and consider postponing whatever he was planning to do. But Mike's most challenging preparation involved studying the Latino Mafia's security procedures and identifying the optimal time to execute his theft. This research required Mike to conduct surveillance operations that brought him dangerously close to discovery by the crime family's security personnel. Mike's closest call came when he was photographing one of the car wash locations from a parking lot across the street. Mike had been using a telephoto lens to document the movement of vehicles and personnel when one of the Mafia guards noticed the reflection from his camera lens. The guard immediately began walking toward Mike's location while speaking into a radio. Mike quickly packed his camera equipment and prepared to leave, but the guard was moving faster than expected and would reach Mike's car before he could escape. Mike made a split-second decision to abandon his surveillance position and approach the guard directly while pretending to be a lost tourist looking for directions. Mike's improvised cover story was that he was a photographer visiting Miami to take pictures for a travel magazine and had gotten lost while looking for scenic locations. Mike showed the guard some legitimate tourist photographs he had taken earlier and asked for directions to popular photography spots. The guard seemed suspicious, but had no reason to detain Mike or prevent him from leaving. Mike drove away from the car wash knowing that his surveillance activities had attracted unwanted attention and that the crime family might now be aware that someone was watching their operations. Mike realized that his window of opportunity was closing even faster than he had anticipated and that he needed to execute his theft immediately. Mike learned that the crime family conducted their largest money movements on specific dates when multiple operations would be consolidated for efficiency. Mike identified November 2nd as the perfect target date because 3 high-value vehicles would be processed simultaneously. But Mike's plan was nearly derailed by a technical problem that he discovered during his final test of the hidden compartments in his father's camping trailer. One of the compartments had developed a leak that would allow water to enter and potentially damage the stolen money during transport. Mike had only hours to repair the problem before his planned theft. Mike worked through the night to fix the compartment using materials he found in his father's workshop. The repair required Mike to remove and reinstall several panels while ensuring that the compartment would remain waterproof and invisible to casual inspection. Mike tested the repair multiple times using a garden hose to simulate heavy rain conditions. Mike's moral struggles intensified as his plan became more detailed and realistic. He understood that stealing from the Latino Mafia would make him a target for the rest of his life, and that innocent people might be hurt if the crime family suspected them of involvement. Mike spent sleepless nights questioning whether his desire for financial freedom justified the risks he was taking. Mike's doubts were complicated by his feelings about his daughter Emma, who was growing up without a father because he couldn't afford the legal fees needed to fight for custody rights. Mike told himself that the stolen money would allow him to provide Emma with opportunities and experiences that his tow truck driver's salary could never afford. Mike convinced himself that he was not just stealing for personal gain, but for his daughter's future. But Mike's resolve was tested when he encountered a corrupt police officer who seemed to know about his activities. Detective Rick Moreno approached Mike at a gas station and began asking pointed questions about Mike's work schedule and the types of vehicles he had been towing recently. Moreno claimed to be investigating reports of suspicious activity at local car washes. Mike realized that Moreno was probably on the Latino Mafia's payroll and was fishing for information about potential threats to their operation. Mike played dumb and answered Moreno's questions as innocuously as possible, while trying to determine how much the detective actually knew about his surveillance activities. Moreno's questioning became more aggressive when he asked Mike about his financial situation and whether he had been experiencing any unexpected expenses or changes in his lifestyle. Mike understood that these questions were designed to determine whether he might be susceptible to bribes or threats from criminal organizations. Mike maintained his cover story about being a struggling tow truck driver who was just trying to pay his bills and support his daughter. Mike even showed Moreno his actual bank statements to prove that he was living paycheck to paycheck and had no significant assets or income sources. Moreno seemed satisfied but warned Mike to be careful about getting involved in situations that were beyond his understanding. The encounter with Detective Moreno convinced Mike that the Latino crime family was actively investigating potential threats to their operation, and that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Mike realized that any further delay could result in his identification as a security risk and his elimination by the crime family. Mike's careful planning was nearly ruined when he was recognized by Mafia associates while eating dinner at a Cuban restaurant in Little Havana. Mike had chosen the restaurant because it was far from his usual haunts, and he thought he would be safe from observation. But two men at a nearby table began watching Mike closely, and one of them made a phone call while staring directly at him. Mike realized that his surveillance activities had attracted attention, and that the crime family might be investigating him as a potential threat. Mike forced himself to finish his meal normally while planning his escape route from the restaurant. When Mike stood to leave, the two men also prepared to follow him, creating a dangerous situation that could have exposed his entire plan. Mike's military training helped him evade the men who were following him from the restaurant. Mike used techniques he had learned during his service to lose his pursuers in the crowded streets of Miami. Mike took an indirect route back to his apartment using public transportation and taxi services to make it difficult for anyone to track his movements. The incident at the restaurant convinced Mike that he needed to accelerate his timeline and execute his theft before the Mafia could investigate him further. Mike realized that his window of opportunity was closing and that any delay could result in his discovery and elimination. Mike decided to proceed with his plan on November 2nd, regardless of whether his preparations were completely finished. Mike's final preparation involved testing his escape route one more time to ensure that he could reach his father's warehouse without being followed or detected. During this test run, Mike discovered that construction work had blocked one of his planned routes, and that he would need to improvise an alternate path on the day of the theft. Mike also discovered that his backup vehicle had developed mechanical problems that would prevent it from being used if his primary escape plan failed. Mike had only hours to find and prepare another backup vehicle before executing his theft. Mike purchased a used motorcycle that could navigate through traffic and reach areas where larger vehicles could not follow. The motorcycle purchase required Mike to use his real identification because he didn't have time to arrange a transaction using his false documents. Mike realized that this created a potential trail that law enforcement could follow if they discovered his involvement in the theft. But Mike had no other options and proceeded with the purchase despite the risks. Mike's plan required him to falsify GPS records, modify his towing route, and temporarily divert the vehicles to an abandoned warehouse where his father had once worked as a mechanic. Mike would have exactly 4 hours to remove the money from the vehicles and replace it with decoy packages before returning the cars to the impound lot. The abandoned warehouse was perfect for Mike's purposes because it was isolated, had no security cameras, and included a large garage where Mike could work without being observed. Mike had access to the building because his father had left him the keys before dying of COVID complications earlier that year. Mike tested his plan multiple times using his own vehicle to ensure that the timing would work. But on the morning of November 2nd, everything that could go wrong seemed determined to test Mike's nerves and preparation. Mike arrived at Cruise Recovery Headquarters at 6:30 a.m. as usual, only to discover that his regular tow truck had developed hydraulic problems overnight. The truck's lifting mechanism was making strange noises and leaking fluid that created a puddle under the vehicle. Mike's backup truck was smaller and older with a less powerful engine that might struggle to handle the weight of the luxury vehicles he planned to steal. Mike also realized that the backup truck's GPS system was different from his regular vehicle, and he would need to quickly adapt his jamming device to work with the new system. Mike spent precious minutes in the parking lot modifying his GPS jammer while trying to appear like he was conducting routine vehicle maintenance. Other drivers were arriving for work, and Mike couldn't afford to attract attention by spending too much time working on electronic equipment. Mike's hands were shaking as he made the final adjustments to his device. On the morning of November 2nd, Mike arrived at work as usual and waited for the radio calls that would trigger his theft. But the first complication came when his usual dispatcher Anthony Ruiz called in sick and was replaced by Maria Gonzalez, a veteran dispatcher who was known for following procedures exactly and asking detailed questions about any irregularities. Mike realized that Maria would be much more difficult to fool than Anthony, and that his false GPS records might not survive her scrutiny. Mike needed to be extra careful about his radio communications and ensure that his modified routes seemed completely legitimate to someone who was paying close attention. The first call came at 9:15 a.m. directing him to tow a Mercedes S-Class from near a car wash on Flagler Street. Mike followed his normal routine, but as he approached the location, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. A Miami Police patrol car was parked directly across from the car wash, and the officer inside was watching the area carefully. Mike drove past the Mercedes without stopping while trying to determine whether the police presence was routine or whether law enforcement had somehow learned about the Latino Mafia's money laundering operation. Mike circled the block twice before deciding that the patrol car was probably conducting random surveillance and was not specifically targeting the vehicle he needed to steal. Mike approached the Mercedes on his second pass and began the process of preparing it for towing. But as he was connecting the tow cables, Mike noticed that the patrol car officer had gotten out of his vehicle and was walking in his direction. Mike's heart rate spiked as he realized that the officer might ask questions about why he was towing the Mercedes. Mike forced himself to continue working normally while preparing to answer questions about his authority to tow the vehicle. Mike had legitimate towing orders from the city, but he was terrified that a detailed investigation might reveal inconsistencies in his paperwork or lead to the discovery of his plan. The police officer approached Mike and asked to see his towing authorization and vehicle registration. Mike handed over the documents with steady hands while internally panicking about being discovered. The officer examined the paperwork carefully and asked Mike about the owner of the Mercedes and why it was being towed. Mike explained that the vehicle had been reported as illegally parked and that he was following standard city procedures for removing abandoned or improperly placed vehicles. The officer seemed satisfied with Mike's explanation and returned his documents without further questions. Mike completed the towing process and drove away while constantly checking his mirrors for signs that he was being followed. Mike followed his normal routine, but instead of driving directly to the impound lot, he took a carefully planned detour to the abandoned warehouse. Mike's modified GPS jammer was working perfectly, and his dispatcher would see false location data indicating that he was taking a standard route to the impound facility. At the warehouse, Mike quickly backed the Mercedes into the garage and began the most dangerous part of his operation. Mike had exactly 25 minutes to remove the money from the vehicle and replace it with decoy materials before he needed to deliver the car to the impound lot to maintain his schedule. Mike removed the trunk panels with practiced efficiency and discovered $1.7 million in cash packed in vacuum-sealed bags. The money was heavier than Mike had anticipated, and he struggled to lift the packages while working as quickly as possible. Mike's back muscles strained as he transferred bundle after bundle of cash to his secure storage containers. But Mike's operation was nearly ruined when he discovered that one of the money packages had been secured with a hidden alarm device that began beeping loudly when he moved it. Mike had never encountered this type of security measure during his previous observations, and he panicked as he tried to figure out how to disable the alarm. Mike realized that the beeping device was probably a motion detector designed to alert the Mafia if their money was being tampered with. Mike had only minutes to find and disable the alarm before it triggered a security response that could bring armed criminals to his location. Mike worked frantically to locate the source of the beeping sound while sweat poured down his face. Mike finally found a small electronic device attached to the underside of one money package and managed to disconnect its battery just as the beeping was becoming loud enough to attract attention from outside the warehouse. Mike completed his work on the Mercedes in exactly 18 minutes despite the alarm complications. He transferred the money to secure containers while replacing it with bags filled with bricks, car batteries, and other heavy objects that would maintain the vehicle's weight. Mike also had to ensure that his decoy packages were arranged exactly like the original money to avoid detection during casual inspection. Mike drove the Mercedes to the impound lot while constantly monitoring his radio for any signs that his altered schedule had been detected by dispatch. Mike's hands were still shaking from his encounter with the hidden alarm device, and he realized that the Latino Mafia's security measures were more sophisticated than he had anticipated. The second vehicle was a Lexus LX that contained $1.2 million, hidden in a specially constructed compartment beneath the rear seats. But Mike's operation on this vehicle was complicated by the arrival of an unexpected visitor at the warehouse. Mike had just begun removing the money from the Lexus when he heard a car engine outside the warehouse. Mike quickly turned off the lights and peered through a window to see a security guard from a neighboring business walking around the warehouse perimeter. The guard was carrying a flashlight and seemed to be investigating reports of suspicious activity in the area. Mike realized that someone had probably seen him entering the warehouse with the towed vehicles and had called security to investigate. Mike needed to remain hidden until the guard left, but he also needed to complete his theft and return the Lexus to the impound lot within his scheduled time frame. Mike waited in the darkness for 20 agonizing minutes while the security guard circled the warehouse and tested doors and windows. Mike could hear the guard's footsteps on the gravel outside and occasionally saw the beam from his flashlight through cracks in the building's walls. The guard eventually concluded that the warehouse was secure and left the area, but Mike had lost valuable time that he could not afford to spare. Mike worked with desperate efficiency to complete his theft of the Lexus while constantly checking his watch and calculating whether he could still maintain his schedule. Mike discovered that the Lexus money was packed in a different type of container that required special tools to open. Mike had prepared for this possibility, but the unfamiliar locking mechanism took longer to defeat than he had anticipated. Mike's hands were shaking as he worked with small tools in the dim light of the warehouse. Mike finally succeeded in opening the money compartment and discovered that the cash was packed in waterproof containers that were designed to survive extreme conditions. Mike realized that the Latino Mafia was taking extraordinary precautions to protect their money during transport, and that his theft would probably be discovered more quickly than he had hoped. Mike completed his work on the Lexus and delivered it to the impound lot, but he was now running several minutes behind his planned schedule. Mike's dispatcher had already radioed twice asking for status updates, and Mike was running out of plausible explanations for his delays. The third vehicle was a BMW X7 that contained not only $1.2 million in cash, but also a USB drive with detailed information about the Latino Mafia's operations, including names, addresses, and logistics routes. Mike realized that the USB drive was potentially more valuable than the money because it could be used to expose the entire criminal network. But Mike's theft of the BMW almost ended in disaster when a security guard from a nearby business noticed him working inside the vehicle at the warehouse. The guard approached Mike's location and demanded to know what he was doing with the car. Mike's heart raced as he realized that his entire plan could be ruined by this unexpected complication. Mike quickly improvised a story about being a repo man who was recovering the vehicle for a finance company. Mike showed the guard fake paperwork that he had prepared for exactly this type of situation and maintained a calm, professional demeanor while internally panicking about being discovered. The guard seemed suspicious but had no legal authority to detain Mike or prevent him from taking the vehicle. But the encounter with the security guard had cost Mike additional time, and he was now seriously behind schedule. Mike's dispatcher, Maria, was asking increasingly pointed questions about his location and estimated arrival times. Mike realized that he might not be able to complete his theft of the BMW without triggering a formal investigation into his activities. Mike made the desperate decision to take the BMW to a different location where he could complete his work more quickly. Mike drove to a parking garage several blocks from the warehouse where he could work inside the vehicle without being observed by security guards or curious passers-by. The parking garage was dimly lit and nearly empty, but Mike still felt exposed as he worked to remove the money from the BMW. Mike had to disassemble more of the vehicle's interior than he had anticipated because the money was hidden in multiple compartments throughout the car. Mike discovered that the BMW contained not only cash but also gold coins and precious gems that significantly increased the total value of his theft. Mike realized that he was stealing far more than the $4 million he had originally calculated, and that the Latino Mafia would probably spare no expense to recover their losses. Mike's work on the BMW was interrupted when another car entered the parking garage and parked nearby. Mike quickly closed the BMW's trunk and pretended to be checking his towing equipment, while the other car's occupants walked to the elevator. Mike waited until they were gone before resuming his theft, but he was now severely behind schedule. Mike finally completed his theft of the BMW and discovered that he had stolen a total of $4.1 million in cash, plus additional valuables worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Mike also found the USB drive that contained detailed information about the Latino Mafia's operations, including financial records and communication logs. But Mike's biggest challenge was still ahead of him. He needed to return the BMW to the impound lot and complete his work shift without arousing suspicion from his dispatcher or co-workers. Mike was now over an hour behind his planned schedule, and Maria was demanding immediate radio contact to verify his location. Mike drove the BMW to the impound lot while frantically trying to think of plausible explanations for his delays. Mike decided to claim that he had encountered traffic problems and mechanical difficulties with his tow truck. Mike also planned to blame some of his delays on uncooperative vehicle owners who had demanded to see additional paperwork. Mike's story seemed to satisfy Maria, but she warned him that his completion times were being carefully monitored and that any future delays would be investigated by management. Mike realized that his theft had probably attracted enough attention to trigger additional scrutiny of his activities. By 6 p.m., Mike had successfully stolen $4.1 million from Los Hermanos del Sur and returned all 3 vehicles to the impound lot. The vehicles appeared completely normal, and there was no indication that they had been tampered with. Mike drove home that evening knowing that he had committed the crime of his life, and that the crime family would eventually discover the theft. Mike's hands were still shaking as he parked his truck at Cruise Recovery Headquarters and completed his shift paperwork. Mike had successfully executed the most complex operation of his life, but he knew that the most dangerous part was still ahead of him. Mike needed to survive the Latino Mafia's response and escape Miami before they could identify him as the thief. Mike didn't have to wait long for the Mafia's response. 2 days after the theft, Anthony Ruiz failed to show up for work and was found dead in his apartment under circumstances that police described as suspicious. Local news reports mentioned the accidental death of a car wash manager who had been shot during what appeared to be a robbery attempt. Mike realized that the crime family was eliminating anyone who might have information about the theft. Mike's phone rang at 11 p.m. on November 4th, and he heard a voice with a heavy Spanish accent that made his blood run cold. "Mr. Tow Truck," the voice said, "you have something that isn't ours and we want it back." Mike pretended not to understand what the caller was talking about, but he knew that the Mafia had identified him as a suspect in the theft. Mike immediately activated his escape plan. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment by selling his possessions, converting cash into untraceable forms, and identifying escape routes out of Miami. Mike knew that he had very little time before the crime family would take direct action against him. The next morning, Mike received an unexpected visitor that confirmed his worst fears. A man claiming to be a police officer arrived at Mike's apartment, but something about him seemed wrong. The man wore no badge, had no identification, and carried an unmarked pistol that he pointed directly at Mike's head. "Where's our money?" the fake officer demanded while pressing the gun against Mike's temple. Mike had anticipated this scenario and prepared accordingly. He pretended to be confused and frightened, claiming that he didn't know anything about missing money. Mike's performance was convincing enough to make the fake officer hesitate for just a moment. That hesitation was all Mike needed to disarm his attacker using techniques he had learned during a brief stint in the military years earlier. Mike struck the fake officer in the throat with a precise blow that rendered him unconscious without causing permanent injury. Mike had no intention of becoming a killer, but he also had no choice but to defend himself against people who would not hesitate to eliminate him. Mike quickly gathered his emergency supplies and prepared to flee his apartment immediately. As Mike left his building, he discovered that the Latino Mafia had positioned additional operatives outside to prevent his escape. 3 men in expensive suits were waiting near the parking garage, and they opened fire as soon as they saw Mike. Mike dove behind a parked car as bullets shattered windows and sparked off concrete walls around him. Mike's escape from the apartment complex was like something from an action movie. He used his knowledge of the building's layout to reach a service exit that the Mafia had not anticipated. Mike emerged from the building on the opposite side from where the gunmen were waiting and managed to reach his truck before they could reposition themselves. But Mike's escape was complicated by the fact that one of the Mafia operatives had spotted him and was now pursuing him through the streets of Miami. Mike found himself in a high-speed chase through residential neighborhoods while trying to reach his father's warehouse without leading his pursuers to the location where he had hidden the stolen money. Mike used his knowledge of Miami's street layout to navigate through areas where his pursuer's larger vehicle would have difficulty following. Mike drove through narrow alleys, construction zones, and even a shopping mall parking garage in his efforts to lose the Mafia operative who was chasing him. The chase lasted over 30 minutes and covered most of downtown Miami. Mike finally lost his pursuer by driving into a multi-level parking garage and abandoning his truck on the third floor. Mike escaped from the garage on foot and used public transportation to reach a location where he had hidden a backup vehicle. Mike's contingency planning had anticipated exactly this type of situation, and he was prepared to abandon his primary escape route if necessary. Mike drove directly to his father's abandoned warehouse where he had hidden the stolen money in his father's old camping trailer. The trailer was a vintage Airstream that his father had used for fishing trips before his death. Mike had modified the trailer's interior to create hidden compartments that could hold millions of dollars without being detected during casual inspection. Mike loaded the trailer onto his backup truck and began driving north out of Miami, using back roads that avoided major highways and traffic cameras. Mike's plan was to reach the Georgia border before the crime family could organize an effective search for him. Mike knew that every minute counted and that his survival depended on staying ahead of his pursuers. But Mike's escape was nearly ruined by an unexpected roadblock on the outskirts of Miami. Los Hermanos del Sur had used their connections with corrupt law enforcement officials to establish fake police checkpoints on major roads leading out of the city. When Mike approached the checkpoint, he saw what appeared to be legitimate police officers conducting vehicle inspections. Mike realized that this was actually a Mafia operation designed to catch him before he could escape Miami. Mike had no choice but to proceed through the checkpoint and hope that his hidden compartments would not be discovered during inspection. Mike's heart raced as the fake officers directed him to pull over for a detailed search of his vehicle and trailer. The crime family operatives were thorough in their search, examining every accessible part of Mike's truck and trailer. They used flashlights to look under the vehicle, check the engine compartment, and even opened cabinets inside the trailer. But Mike's hidden compartments were professionally constructed and designed to be invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. After 20 minutes of searching, the fake officers found nothing suspicious and allowed Mike to continue his journey. Mike maintained his calm demeanor throughout the inspection, but inside he was celebrating his narrow escape. Mike smiled as he drove away from the checkpoint, knowing that he had outwitted some of the most dangerous criminals in America. Mike continued driving north through the night using a carefully planned route that avoided major cities and law enforcement checkpoints. But Mike's escape was complicated by another roadblock at the Florida-Georgia border, where legitimate state police were conducting routine vehicle inspections as part of a drug interdiction program. This second checkpoint was more dangerous because the officers were real law enforcement officials who would follow proper procedures if they discovered anything suspicious. Mike had prepared fake documentation for this scenario, but he knew that professional investigators would be much more difficult to fool than Mafia operatives pretending to be police officers. Mike approached the checkpoint with confidence and handed over his false identification when requested. The state trooper examined Mike's documents carefully and asked routine questions about his travel plans and destination. Mike explained that he was moving to North Carolina for a new job and was transporting his personal belongings in the camping trailer. The trooper seemed satisfied with Mike's explanation and was about to wave him through when a drug detection dog alerted to something in Mike's trailer. Mike's heart stopped as he realized that the dog might have detected traces of drug residue on the money he had stolen from the Latino Mafia. Mike prepared for the worst as additional officers were called to conduct a more thorough search. But Mike's luck held when the officers discovered that the dog had actually detected the scent from a bag of dog treats that Mike had placed in the trailer as part of his cover story. Mike explained that he had been caring for his father's dog before it died and had forgotten about the treats. The officers accepted this explanation and allowed Mike to continue his journey after a brief delay. Mike's final escape from Florida was successful, but he knew that his safety was only temporary. The Latino crime family would never stop looking for him, and Mike would have to remain constantly vigilant for the rest of his life. If you made it this far, hit the like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what would you have done in Mike's place?